Morning, guys. How you doing? Mr. Davis here. This is the second of our sessions on sociology of sport. And just to get us up and running, a few knowledge recall questions from yesterday's session. Really important that you get your heads around these definitions. So if this is something that you struggled with a little, please do spend some time going over it and over it and over it, and make sure that you're really, really clear on what each of these key terms means and how it impacts on sport and participation in sport. So just take your time to go through each of these questions, make sure that you've got an answer written down for each one of them as if it was sort of exam assessment type question. And we'll pick it up again shortly with some review of the answers. Okay, so let's just go through them all together here. It's all come up together, so we'll just take it one at a time. First one, two main concerns of sociology. So when we're talking about sociology, it's all about people, and there's two key aspects to it: examining the interactions and interdependence. So how people kind of go about their business with each other and how they interact and how the different personalities and different relationships form and how people become dependent on each other within a society. And then the second part is examining how behavior can be controlled. So looking at different factors, different social conditions that impact on people's behavior and people's lifestyle choices and the way that they go about doing what they do. So interactions and also control of behavior, that's the key thing there. Second one was just a definition of society, a term that you're probably familiar with, but just being clear about, you have to be clear about these definitions. So it's worth writing them out a number of times, checking it against the correct definition, covering it up again, making sure that you're clear on these things, so it's not just a bumbled jumble of words that you're coming up with. Is actually some clarity, and definitions have to be pretty much on the money. So an organized group of people associated for some specific purpose or with a shared common interest. Now you might find a slightly that's more straightforward way of putting that down as a statement, but essentially those are the sorts of terms that you've got to be using. So it's an organized group of people that share some sort of specific purpose or a sort of a common interest. Number three, the distinction between primary and secondary socialization. So when we looked at socialization yesterday, there were a couple of different things that you needed to be clear on. So socialization, the lifelong process where members of society learn like values and norms and common behaviors that should take place within that society. And there's two kind of stages, if you like, in terms of that socialization process. Primary, which takes place during like the very early years. Prominent influence on that is your immediate family. So as you're very young and you're growing up, the kind of the behavior and the norms and the values that you pick up and are naturally kind of embedded into your behavior, the family are the key group there in terms of that influence. Then the secondary socialization stage is the kind of the next part of it, where it's teenage and adult years, where influence peers. So peers are kind of like the people around you, usually of like a similar age, or people that you tend to spend time with. Your friends, so that can be, peers and friends are quite similar, but friends are probably people that you just hold a little bit closer to your heart and maybe spend a bit more time with. And the school are a huge influence during this phase. So it's very important that you're clear on the distinction between primary and secondary socialization. And then finally, and there were others, but the fourth question, a definition of social change. So this one's a little bit more concise, but an alteration in the social order of society. So remember, it's quite a difficult thing to achieve, and it needs certain factors and certain kind of buy-in of key groups, particularly groups of people in positions of authority and power and control. So whether that's like decision makers in the country or within your kind of local area, for that change to happen. And remember, the second part of that that kind of concept is not just a significant change, but a significant change with a lasting long-term impact. And for that to happen, there's a number, it takes time, and there's a number of different factors that need to be kind of put in place for it to be established. So do make sure that you're clear on those. It's worth pausing the video here, going over your notes again. We're going to do, or certainly going to try and do a kind of a little test on this section of the work, probably on Monday. And obviously, for that to be effective, you want to give yourself a good chance. You know, it's going to be, can you define this? Can you give examples of this? Can you explain how this might impact on sporting participation? So you have to be very clear on it. Okay, so essentially we're just picking up from where we left off yesterday. So I've just called it, it's still the sociology of sport, but it's part 2 of this, same learning objective, a couple of different key terms that we're looking at today. Social stratification, sounds very complicated, and social class. So just make a note of that, worth just going new page, note down title, date, learning objective, and the key terms at the top, just so it's clear in your folder, rather than, you know, just a random bit of paper scattered around. And on that, I'll keep saying this, please, please, please make sure, you know, we're due back in school in a couple of weeks, and one of the first things I'm going to want to do is see these folders of all of your work. For that not to be an embarrassing and painful process, you need to make sure that your folders are looking sharp. You know, ideally a different folder for each section of the exam, section A, B, and C. We're working on section C now, so all to do with sport and society. And this is the kind of, there's kind of 2 units, if you like, within that for the first year, and we're working, this is the start of the second one. So yeah, enough rambling. Hopefully you've got all of that down and we are good to go. So social stratification, let's just get a definition down, because this part of the exam is very much around key terms and definitions. So a type of social inequality where society is divided into different levels on the basis of social characteristics such as wealth or status. So stratification is essentially like another word for like an arrangement or an organization. So if you think hierarchy is a really good word to think about here, in terms of it's about levels, and it's about the organization and arrangement of those levels within society. So just read it through again as you're noting it down. A type of social inequality where society is divided into different levels on the basis of social characteristics such as wealth or status. Now I've put these images on here, not because they've got any particularly like invaluable information, but it just gives you a good visual image of what this idea of social stratification is. In simple terms, the one on the right just sums up. Don't worry about the writing at the bottom, other than, you know, you've got the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class, and that sort of distinction between classes that runs like way back into when we were looking at the early 19th century, and before we even started talking about middle class, you just had the lower class, who were essentially the poor people in society, and the upper class where the money and the wealth and the kind of nobility and almost royalty. That distinction, that is social stratification, the kind of the leveling off of people in society. The image on the left sort of splits it a little bit more, but it just gives you that kind of idea of where the power, where the control, where the money, where the almost freedom of opportunity is at the top, and at the bottom is the struggle and the hardship and the you know, the hard grind that people have to go through in their life. It's the distinction between those levels. That's what social stratification is all about. So in simple terms, just kind of think it through in your head, try and come up with a more straightforward definition before we kind of drill down on this one. So it's the arrangement or the organization of social classes within society based on things like wealth and status. There are other things as well that might influence it, but the most straightforward one, and arguably the most important, is this idea of wealth and status and money, because unfortunately that is the primary influence on how society is arranged. So an example of that, as I said, back in early 19th century, like feudal society, pre-industrial Britain, you had the upper class who had, and this is where it brings in the relevance of sport, because the upper class, even back then, had a greater access to equipment and facilities, and that meant they could participate in sports such as real tennis, because real tennis required, expensive and almost rare facilities. It wasn't a common thing. It was very much only for the upper class to have these sorts of indoor, like grand indoor facilities, and the equipment itself as well was not kind of readily available to the masses. So that group of people within society were it was only them that were able to participate in those sorts of sports, whereas the lower classes were left to play things like mob football, which was the complete opposite in that it didn't require any level of facilities or equipment or even any sort of structure, more or less just absolute mayhem, where it was, all of those characteristics. It was rough, it was violent, it didn't have any rule or structure, played by the masses. And it's because of their position in this social stratification, this organized structure, that was the type of sport and activity that they engaged with. So that's just the kind of link with where it fits in with early 19th century and how it, even back then, this is a major topic now, even in the current climate of, in modern day, but it was also very relevant, way back then, during feudal society where it was just lower class and upper class. So each slide just kind of goes through this in a little bit more detail, and there's a bit of information that you just need to note down, and then a little task that we just need to think about. So this is a bit of a side, or often a bit of a tangent, but it's also worth thinking about because it's an important aspect of this. One theory that's linked to social stratification is that sport enables people to, I'll just read it through, to leave behind their normal lives and adopt a new athletic identity that's different from their kind of potentially from their normal identity within society. So it temporarily replaces all of those inequalities that they may have felt with a sporting situation where they're equal. So I'll just go through that again. So essentially, sport enables people to move away from their position or their status in society where they may have significant inequalities that they have to deal with, and it allows them to take on a more temporary position of a different status where those inequalities aren't so obvious. And essentially, certainly at the start of it, there's an equality there within sport. So it doesn't necessarily in theory, it doesn't matter what your social status is when you step on that football pitch or you step on a tennis court or a basketball court, whatever it might be, you're just another player in the game. And it might be that you're actually very good and you take on quite a prominent role there. And it's not that you're the lower class and the person that's looked down upon, that struggles with life. You're actually an important person within that. So it's just a theory. It's just something to think about. But it's that idea that sport is a kind of leveler. Now, that's not to say that that's 100% accurate, but it's just part of the theory. And I've got this picture of Serena Williams here, because Serena Williams is arguably one of the greatest sports people of all time, men or women. Hugely successful, earned a huge amount of money, global superstar. But she grew up in a relatively poor family in the early stages of her life in Compton in America. Not an easy place to grow up. Members of her family have been killed with horrible situations where they've had to grow up in kind of really, really challenging circumstances. And she's gone on to be this hugely successful person. So it's that idea that sport has given her the platform to cast aside that initial inequality where, you know, there wasn't huge amounts of money and wealth in her family, and she's gone on to achieve incredible things. So whilst you're not going to get a question like this in the exam, it's worth thinking about what other athletes could you apply this theory to, whether it's athletes or even sports. Can you think of examples where famous athletes have come through from maybe a kind of almost like a lower class background, and sport has enabled them to take on a different role and essentially a different status? Have a think about it. It might be something that you do a little bit of research on, and just to kind of get that idea that sport can play this role of leveling off the social stratification, that the arrangement of people where things like class and wealth and money are almost left behind, and it's more just about sport and performance. Just take a few minutes to think about that before we move on. Okay, so the next slide, this kind of digs down into the kind of reality of it. So yeah, participation in sport sometimes give people, like the people that take in part, an opportunity to almost leave behind their normal lives and take on this new athletic identity. And that's a nice idea. In reality, that's not kind of how it actually works out. So the idea that sport just provides this equality of opportunity, you know, that doesn't quite work. It's problematic. One of the reasons for that is that sport in its very nature, if you look at this diagram on the bottom right, sport in its very nature, you know, drives competition and, you know, success, and people want to be better than the rest of the people taking part. So that in itself kind of leads into this social stratification, because there's a leveling, and there's a kind of a new order that's created within sport. If you're better than someone else, then you're on a higher level than someone else. So that doesn't kind of match up with this idea of everyone's equal and, you know, it's all la-di-da. That's not how it, in reality, that's not how it works. You know, the real world and the people position in the social class generally affects the sports that they might participate in. So yeah, sport might have this kind of providing this opportunity where there's an idea of equality going on there. But one, the general nature of sport promotes competition and an idea of success and dominance. So that's your first point here. You know, so it doesn't quite fit in that sport is just this beautiful leveler. Sport in itself drives competition and promotes a kind of stratification and an arrangement and order. Second point is that you know, the reality is that things like disposable income and social class can have a significant impact on the sorts of sports that you might participate in, whether that's to do with facilities or equipment. You can see some of the, I mean, there's a couple of examples that I've put on here. So it doesn't take a genius to work out which one of those sports is maybe geared towards the upper class. Things like equestrian, polo, and that sort of thing. You would only ever participate in them if you are from the upper class. You know, I'd struggle to think of where there'd be an exception to that rule. I mean, you could always say, oh, if you're a friend of a friend of a friend that got invited, but, you know, the cut and dry of it is that in 99% of cases, it's those sort of sports, you know, equestrian, any other horse-related activities like polo. And you might not even know what polo is. I barely know what polo is, but it's the sort of sport that is played by the upper classes, and because of the facilities and the equipment and the expense that goes along with that, it's all linked to the upper class in society. On the flip side of that, you've got sports maybe that aren't requiring that sort of level of facilities and equipment and cost. So something like basketball, where, you know, whether I know it's and obviously football being the prominent one in Britain, it's with the same idea that, you know, as long as you've got a ball and a bit of space, you can play and you can improve and develop, and you don't need all of this money. So anyone can play, and it's actually in some ways it's suited towards lower and middle class people in society, because you don't need all of those things, and it's the sort of sports that culturally, you know, that sort of group of people would grow up participating in those sports rather than things like equestrian. The other kind of background shot here is of the FA, the Football Association, and the board of the FA. And whilst, you know, a big part of this is about participants, I forgot I've actually got this noted down. A big part of this is about participants, but it's also about the organisation and structure of these sports. So the people that are in charge of these sports in terms of governance and control are often people of wealth and power and a high social status. Those are usually the people that traditionally have held those positions of power. And it's something that's, you know, slowly changing, but it's a slow change. It's often something that's pointed at the FA, this idea that, you know, it's a multicultural game, football, played by, you know, huge numbers of different people from all over the world. But the FA is made up of a board of old white blokes. That's it. Are they really, you know, the right group of people to be making big decisions about the game that is played by so many different people from, you know, different cultures and different backgrounds, and different ethnicities and different races? Why is that not reflected on the people that are making decisions about the game? And it's the same thing at a higher level in FIFA and other national governing bodies. It tends to be, you know, wealthy, older, white men that make decisions, and that's all linked to social stratification. You know, it leads social stratification of society is reflected in sport, and that the hierarchy dictates that those people are the ones that have power and influence at the top. Just make sure that we've got each of those points covered. So the reality, you know, from saying that sport is this platform for equality, that's a nice idea, but in reality, sport provides a competition and a drive towards dominance, which is slightly at odds with that concept, and it's actually, you know, more geared towards this idea of social stratification. It fits in with it because sport in itself, you know, drives that arrangement of, you know, who's the best, where you go on to the top level then. Social class does affect the involvement and participation largely because of income, and then you can give examples of things like equestrian and polo for the upper class, and maybe things like basketball and football for the lower middle class of society. But also this concept that decision makers, people in power, those tend to be, even within sport, as is the way in kind of society as a whole, it tends to be dominated by men, older and older white men that aren't necessarily a true. It's not to say that they're racist or anything like that, but it's just not an accurate representation of the game that's being played by a huge number of different people. That's the point. Okay. Hopefully you've got each of those things down. There are a few tasks coming up. I know that was a bit of a ramble, but that's just that's the key concept here about stratification and some of the key points that you need to make along with some of those examples. So, can you identify a sport and activity linked from those in the middle or upper class group and give reasons why there's a limited access to this activity for those in the lower classes? So an activity that's often played by or participated by middle and upper class people, and giving reasons why is limited access in that activity for the lower class. So why can't the lower class people take part in that activity, or why is it more difficult, more challenging for them? Pause the video here, spend a few minutes thinking about that, trying to give different examples of some of the issues that they might be faced with. Okay, and you should have, amongst other things, this sort of thing. So it's about access being restricted to the upper class, largely based, to do with, finances and money. It's a lack of access to particular clubs and facilities. So whether it's golf clubs, tennis clubs, the membership involved there is quite prohibitive. You have to have a lot of money. It's not something that you can just rock up and engage in. As I said, the cost is significant. And then finally, this kind of links in with the first point, but the strong kind of traditions associated with nobility and higher class. So even if you did have potentially have the finances, are you actually in a position to be able to go and engage with a sport like equestrian? Possibly not, just because of the social setup and the stratification that's involved in that. The arrangement of society kind of dictates that even if someone from the lower or middle class came into some money, that wouldn't necessarily mean that they're just immediately going to go and join an equestrian club or a polo club, because it's not linked into, it's very much driven towards the higher social class in society. Right, next one. And again, I'll start this off with a task and then we'll try to build it up. So this now links into specifically to do with kind of education and schools. If you consider how access and engagement with sport might differ between low-income families and those from a more upper-class background, how access and engagement with sport differs between people from low-income families and those from a more upper-class family. Pause the video, take a minute or two to think about it, try and note a few things down. What are the sorts of things that might dictate the sports and the level of engagement in sport between someone from a lower class family and someone from an upper class family? What are the key differences? Right, so one of the things that you might consider here is that children from low-income families tend to have just poorer health, and that's the sad reality of it. It stands to reason, it's not 100%, but it stands to reason that if you are struggling a little bit for money, then your health might be affected. And if your children's health is affected, that then might impact on their ability to engage in and participate at a level in physical activity in sport. If you're not well, you're not healthy, then you're not likely to participate regularly in sport. So that's one point. Second one is then kind of linked back into the idea of money. So children from low-income families are likely to have less money to spend on equipment, whether that's, even at a low level, whether it's to do with football, like footballs and basketball still cost money. And if you're from a family that doesn't have a lot of money, it's going to be difficult for you to then participate in those sports, let alone doing things like tennis, cricket, golf, anything like that, which are kind of more towards sports that require money, and it's upper class people that have more money. Off the back of that, the idea of coaching, there are clubs and things that people are able to join and facilities that people can go to, but the reality is that if you are from a low income family, you're going to have less disposable income to do, certainly in like specialist coaching. So whether it's, tennis, you might be able to join a football club, but even then there might be a membership that's involved. But specific like individual coaching, tennis coaching is expensive, 20-30 pounds an hour maybe. Joining a cricket club where you need bats and pads and whites and shoes, all of that sort of thing costs money. So to have specific specialist coaching is going to be a difficult thing for someone from a lower income background. The next points are just to do with the nature of maybe the actual schools that people attend. So schools themselves, whilst they don't intend for this to be an issue with like the national curriculum, which is the kind of structure that most schools are provided with by the government to try and say this is the sort of thing that you should be teaching and engaging students with. And that's the idea of that is, you know, it's to try and create this idea of equality and providing a broad and balanced program of study for everyone. In reality, you know, public schools and state schools are different. Public schools have more money. They're often situated in areas of more affluence and more wealth, where students who come from higher class or upper class backgrounds would go to a public school, and you know, generally they might benefit from the better sports facilities and things that they have there, and the more opportunities they'd have there compared to a working class or a lower class individual who would go to a state school and just have to, you know, go along with, you know, the playground or the basketball court outside. So those are the kind of some of the key things to do with access and engagement. And just off the back of that, have a think about this idea of schools, compare the potential differences between sports facilities. If you could think of a state school, whether you know one specifically or whether you just think about it in general, or just use the pictures here as a bit of a guide, what are the differences that you might expect to see between, in terms of facilities, at a state school, so it's like a school that anyone can go to, and a private school where it's, you know, it's very much money driven. You'd have to pay quite large fees to go there, like thousands and thousands of pounds a year. What differences would you expect to see in facilities? Just pause the video here, try and compile a little bit of a list there. Okay, so I would expect comments for that task to be focused on like outdoor facilities. You know, even if you look at the surfaces that they've got there, the range of facilities that are available, the quality of those facilities, the equipment that's available, and again, the range, like not just the equipment, but the range of the equipment and the quality of the equipment, the changing areas, the shower areas, the indoor facilities, the floodlights, all of that, the stands and the spectator areas. You know, it might even be at some schools where they've got like kind of real high-tech equipment to do for video use and that sort of thing, and video analysis. That's just not something that you would expect to see in an average state school. It's not to say it's better, but there are differences there. So just make sure you've got a good range of differences. Okay, then we come to this final task. This is essentially the main final thing that we're going to look at today. So there's a link here on this first point here, which I'm going to want you to click on in a second. And this is a document that's produced by Sport England, which is an organisation that's linked to the kind of government and the kind of distribution of funds and making sure that provision is there for a wide range of different people across different sports, and it gets a lot of government funding, and it's about, you know, how that money's spent. And one of the things they try and do is that in order to make sure that the money is kind of funneled in the right direction, they do these annual surveys to try and track participation and try and work out the reasons why people do and don't take part in regular sport. Now, this particular one, I think, is from a few years ago, but it provides the information that you need. So initially, what I want you to do is about 12 or 13 slides. Don't get too bogged down in the detail. Focus particularly on the information to do with participation, but there is other information there that you might want to note down. And I'm just going to keep this fairly general in saying that I just want you to produce a short kind of report of the key details based on the data and the information provided in this document. So it doesn't have to be incredibly long. I would imagine, you know, maybe try and get, let's say 10 points as a starting point. It might be that you get a few more, but things that stick out, you don't have to copy it word for word. It's not an English test. It has to be perfect sentences, but useful information that I can read it and I can go, oh yeah, I didn't know that, that's interesting. Or yeah, that's an interesting point you've made there. Try and draw that information out, look at the statistics and the data that it shows you there, particularly about different social groups and the participation of those groups, and think about how socio-economic classification, essentially this stratification, affects the likelihood that you might take part in sport and activity or not. So it's a pretty open-ended task just to finish with, but it's important that you get your heads around this idea of, you know, this document highlights social stratification and social inequality, and that's what this whole session has been about. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you can pick out from it. You know, I know that on slide 6 there's some quite useful information, but there's other bits of information on there that you need to be familiar with. The more broad your understanding is of this topic, the easier you will find it to answer exam questions. So yeah, looking forward to seeing the work there. There are some exam questions, I think 3 exam questions that I'm going to tag onto this work as well. It shouldn't take you long to do them, particularly if you've made good notes from this presentation. But do make sure that you've got those ready, because I want to go through all of the exam questions in tomorrow's lesson. So yeah, sorry that this has been a bit delayed to get to you, but hopefully you found it useful. Cool. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.